Good afternoon. Oh, come on. Well, more than that. Welcome to the North Carolina AgTech Professional Forum. Mike Saber in the flesh. It's been a year and a half since I've seen you, I think. Okay. You know I'd embarrass you. So I'm Michelle Von Cannon. I'm the Agricultural Program and Event Manager here at the Biotech Center, and I want to thank all of you for coming. It's so good to start seeing everybody back in person. I know I've seen several of you, but it's nice to have the walls or the seats filling back up. A few little housekeeping notes. We are going to be having Q&A, but I'm going to let them explain how we're doing Q&A. It's going to be a little bit different this time, a little more audience engagement throughout, so they'll give you more information on that shortly. The program is being recorded, knock on wood. I know we said that in February, and then Zoom, not us, Zoom had a nationwide glitch or international glitch right in the middle of our program, and we were not able to retrieve it. So it's the only program we've lost, and I'm very sorry. But we are hoping this time it'll be fine. So we'll have it up next week. Check back if you want to see more. I want to share a few upcoming events. We're starting to slow down as we're approaching summer. But next month, May 24th, we're going to have our Animal Health and Nutrition Forum, which is going to be focusing on canine lymphoma. I'll let you see this. It's up on our website. And June 13th through 16th, if any of you are going to be at the Bio International Convention out in San Diego, we are going to be doing a North Carolina focused effort. So if you are going to be there, please let us know, because we're going to have a Friends of North Carolina reception, and it's a great networking opportunity out there. And then in July or August, we are testing the waters. You know, for many years now, we've done a summer social, and we were talking about revamping this. Summertime is a little hard, you know, everybody's on vacation, taking, sabbatical, whatever, we understand, but we wanted to see who would be up for just a big networking party. Maybe not a program, maybe a program. So during the reception, please find Nandini, Paul, and myself. Just let us know if you'd be up for it, because we have some ideas. And then we will be back in person September 21st for our next forum, which the topic will be on animal health and nutrition, and we'll be announcing information on that in the next couple of months, so stay tuned. All right. I would like to also note our supporting sponsor, Myers-Beagle, and our patrons, HPG and Alexandria Scent Labs. It's without these partners, we couldn't do these programs, and we're really thankful for them, and they have been with us since the beginning, so longtime partners. But I also want to point out our lead sponsor this month, Smith Anderson. And with that, I'm going to introduce Chris Smith, the Smith, no, I'm just kidding, at Smith Anderson, who is going to come up and introduce today's program and give you an overview. Thanks. Oops.
Thank you, Michelle.
I went too far. Sorry.
Good afternoon, everybody. Michelle, thanks for that introduction. For me and for Smith Anderson, we are very happy to sponsor this event. At Smith Anderson, we are privileged to represent traditional agriculture, including Mitch Peele's employer, the Farm Bureau Federation, as well as many, many AgTech companies who are also members of the Biotech Center. Like the Biotech Center and like the North Carolina Chamber, where Ray Starling now works, at Smith Anderson, we have been working to facilitate the connection between traditional agriculture and some of the mind-bending technologies and data applications that companies like Carrie Harbinson and her colleagues at SAS have pioneered with their agriculture analytics. The connection between these two communities needs to succeed to strengthen the bonds of our civic society as we work to slake the thirst and feed the gaping maw of the world's 7.9 billion people, soon to be 8 billion next year. Part of helping that relationship includes work to ensure that those of us who don't live where our food is grown and raised better understand what it takes to get a pork chop or green beans into the Harris Teeter. People who live in the cities and suburbs of North Carolina generally don't appreciate that North Carolina is classified as 80% rural. And most people don't appreciate that agriculture and agribusiness account for 1/6 of the state's gross product, more than 16% of all our jobs, and that it's the biggest economic sector in the state, greater than the US military, greater than the state government, the pharmaceutical industry, all down the line. To put it in perspective, the state has about 46,000 farms on approximately 8.4 million acres of land. North Carolina itself contains 34 million acres of land. Thus, fully 1/4 of North Carolina's land is in agricultural production. An additional 60% of the state is forested. These facts surprise many people. Today's discussion explores some of those gaps in knowledge and understanding and explains the results of a polling study of attitudes undertaken by the North Carolina Chamber with SAS and with the help of Farm Bureau. The study was geared to learn what ordinary people, not the activists who usually bring megaphones with their advocacy, but what ordinary people think about agriculture. Understanding the facts is always the starting point for addressing an issue and avoiding misunderstandings and enabling us to weave our civic society more tightly and more constructively. Our three presenters are Mitch Peele here on the left, Carrie Harbinson on the right, and Ray Starling in the middle. Each of our speakers comes from institutions which, like my law firm, are committed to working to strengthen the state's civic infrastructure. Mitch is Senior Director of Public Policy for the North Carolina Farm Bureau Federation, representing 35,000 North Carolina farm families. He has broad responsibility for all commodity, environmental, and regulatory programs for Farm Bureau, and has served on industry stakeholder committees dealing with legislative and policy issues, as well as on the North Carolina General Assembly Legislative Study Commissions. He is Chair Emeritus of the AgTech Council here at this center. He and his colleagues on that council are focused on the development of agriculture technology throughout the state. Our firm has been privileged to work with Mitch and his colleagues for many years. Carrie Harbinson is a manager within SAS's United States AgTech and Consumer Goods Practice. I got that right, didn't I? Yes. Along with her team, she works in a strategic capacity to partner with industry leaders across the food value chain as they seek to solve complex industry challenges through the application of advanced analytics. Prior to joining SAS in 2020, Carrie worked for UNC Chapel Hill's Corporate and Foundation Relations team and UNC Keenan-Flagler Business School. Carrie also worked at the CED, Counsel for Entrepreneurial Development, where she ran a mentorship program for growth stage entrepreneurs seeking investment and scaling partners. At CED is where my colleagues at Smith Anderson first had the privilege to work with her. Ray Starling is the General Counsel of the North Carolina Chamber and president of its Legal Institute, where he helps develop policies to nurture the business climate to create wealth and opportunity for all North Carolinians. Prior to his current position, he was in Washington, D.C., serving as Chief of Staff to then Secretary of Agriculture Sonny Perdue. He has taught agricultural law and policy at UNC, NC State, and Campbell. Known to many of his friends as the poet and scholar farmer. That's actually not, he's maybe known to me because I just made that up. But I think it could get traction. We've got some people from the chamber here who could like live tweet that, hashtag PSF, Poet Scholar Farmer. Poet Scholar Farmer. He has a book coming out this summer that speaks to many of the issues on today's agenda. It is entitled Farmers versus Foodies, a look at the outside forces forging the future of farming and food. Central to how he developed his service commitment to our civic infrastructure is that he grew up on a century family farm in southeastern North Carolina. That is where Ray and his kin have been farming the same land and building community for more than a century. Most importantly, he is among the dwindling number of persons who truly understands that the purpose of a good pickup truck is not to keep it shiny clean to drive to a fancy restaurant and park for dinner, but to put, and in this audience, I'll say euphemistically, all kinds of sugar, honey, and iced tea in the back and haul it around.
You're here.
That's it. That's it. I think Mitch is our leadoff here, but please welcome all of our speakers.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon, everybody. Like Chris says, I'm sort of the opening act. The main attraction is follows me, so I'll just say a few words to begin with, sort of give you an idea of what we're going to talk about this afternoon, how it's going to flow. Then after Ray and Carrie do their part, I'll come up and have a few closing remarks and talk about some of the things we did last year as well. How many of you grew up on a farm? Quite a number of you. That's, as you would imagine, that's unusual in an audience this size. We have all heard the saying that most people today are several generations removed from the farm. In fact, I think they're probably 3 or 4 generations on the average removed from the farm. And that includes people like myself who have spent my entire career working in agriculture even. But because of that, we have this huge disconnect between today's consumers and today's agriculture. And that creates real problems for farmers and others of us that work in the ag community. Because of that misconception, they have a misunderstanding of agriculture. They're getting their information from sources that are not related to agriculture in many cases. They follow social media sites that have a lot to say about today's agriculture. A lot of those groups are not related to agriculture. In fact, they don't even agree with a lot of the modern agricultural practices. Because of that misconception, that leads to bad public policy quite often and hurts farmers and those of us involved in the ag community. So we began many years ago looking for ways to bring consumers and agriculture together to have meaningful conversations about today's agriculture and to respond to the questions and concerns consumers have. And we over the years, we have formed groups like at the national level. You've probably heard of the U.S. Farmer and Rancher Alliance in Action. That's kind of a who's who in agriculture and working together to address this problem. But here in North Carolina, we created a group back in 2010 called Feed the Dialogue NC Foundation. And that's an effort to bring North Carolina consumers and farmers and other food voices together to have these meaningful conversations. And a lot of research has been done over the years that shows if you base those communications on values that farmers and consumers have in common, then they're more likely to be motivated, consumers are, to have conversations with farmers and those of us in agriculture. And so this idea of shared values was tossed around early last year. And we decided that maybe we needed to do some research in North Carolina to see what consumers think about agriculture. There had been a lot of those done at the national level, and we wanted to test those here in North Carolina. So we put together this idea of this shared values project that involves doing consumer research in two parts. Number one, doing a statewide poll that the chamber, working with SAS and others, have done, and you're going to hear about that in just a moment. I think it involved over 650 people across the state. So a poll is a good way to ask a lot of questions of a lot of people. And then we followed that up with the second part, North Carolina Farm Bureau working with Blue Red Marketing and a lot of funding partners across the state did focus groups. We did 4 focus groups in the summer of last year. And you have smaller audiences there. You have about 10 at each of focus groups. But the thing about focus groups is you can dig deeper into those questions once you ask those of the consumers. So those 2 parts of the consumer research was done last summer. And then we followed that up in November of last year. And we brought all of the commodity groups together and other ag and allied organizations to share that research with them, working with the Center for Food Integrity. And over a 2-day period, we broke those groups up into various rooms, and they went through the research findings, and they identified recommendations, how we can put this research together to help us all be better communicators with today's consumers. So that's sort of the idea of the Shared Values Project. And so I'm going to stop at this point, and I didn't even use my slides, Michelle. But so much we're sticking to the script. So you're going to hear about the poll that the chamber and SAS did, and then I'll follow that up with some concluding remarks. There you go.
Thanks, Mitch. I'll let Carrie maybe try to get us to the right place since Mitch has already blown the plan. But first of all, thanks, Mitch. Great setup. Also, thanks to the Biotech Center for having us for this conversation. Paul and Michelle, always a pleasure to work with you all. Certainly, Chris would be remiss if I didn't mention thank you, not just for the introduction, but for the long-running partnership between the Chamber and Smith Anderson and what you all do in this space. And then, of course, SAS. This particular data set that we came up with, we obviously would not have were it not for the partnership with SAS, and frankly, not just monetarily, but also in helping us think through what questions do we want to ask, what do we want to dig in on, what do we want to know. Is it not working? It's on. I'm green.
He's from Sampson County. He does not need a microphone.
Oh. Can you hear it? It picks up? I just need to go higher.
There you go.
How about now? Can you hear me now? Okay, good. Well, the only part you really needed to hear about that was I made a joke about Mitch to start with. So, and I said thank you to a lot of people. So one other person I want to make sure that this group becomes accustomed to seeing. Peter, do you mind saying, just throwing your hand up in the back of the room? Peter Daniel covers the ag portfolio for us at the Chamber from a legislative perspective, and we're very lucky to have him. And so I want folks to meet him. He'll actually slip out at the end because he has to present public comments at a hearing tonight. At least it's on Zoom, so if you see him talking to himself in the parking lot, he's actually testifying at a hearing. So Peter, thank you for coming. When he stands up, you'll see he's also my security. He's about 6 inches taller than me and about 100 more pounds. So that's a neat symbiotic partnership as well. But so the word you've heard the most is partnership, right? And I remember coming back from Washington and sitting down, frankly, with a leader from the biotech sector out in the park, having lunch, and him saying that that's the operative word, that's the point, that's where we're at, that we're at a place where large companies, even by themselves, no matter how large, are going to be able to crack some of these problems that we're having now. And so one of the things that we feel like we do at the Chamber is a bit of translation work, translation between what our members are sensing and feeling and needing and what our policymakers downtown need to implement to make our environment better for them to function. To do that means you've got to actually understand what people think. And I think often we can be guilty of thinking we know what people think because they think like us, right? They think what we think. Well, that's not exactly correct. And that view gets reinforced when we're on Twitter or elsewhere, and the algorithm figures out, which, by the way, for like 10 years, I called it a logarithm. And finally, somebody said that's the wrong rhythm word. So the algorithm, gives you what you want to hear, gives you more of what you already think. And so over the course of the last 2 or 3 years, we've started a project at the Chamber called the Quarterly Polling Club, where we partner with someone and go into the field and literally ask folks across the state of North Carolina, what do you think about this issue? So about half of that poll is typically political in nature, but the other half is very substantive in terms of an issue of the day. And so we're tickled to have SAS as a partner for this particular data set here. And I think, frankly, was the perfect partner, SAS, with its roots in agriculture. And now I think with a reemergence and a commitment with people like Carrie to re-enter that industry with a little more splash and a little more heft. You all know Bill Danker, who's been a part of this group and this conversation for a long time. So I was thrilled that Carrie and her colleagues said, sure, count us in. We'll create the survey. And after some remarks from Carrie, we're going to jump in and walk through what we learned.
Sounds good. So it's an honor to be here alongside both Ray and Mitch today. So thanks to the Biotech Center for hosting us. As Ray alluded, the AgTech practice at SAS was established in 2019. And, the thesis was really a top-down investment in ag, to work with leading ag companies as well as innovators to drive innovation and empower the work of agriculture across the food chain. And so one interesting piece, you also alluded to this, ag is, even though we established the practice in 2019, it is part of SAS's roots. So the first statistical analysis system, which is the SAS in the SAS namesake, was developed in the early 1970s by our founder, Dr. Goodnight, actually to analyze agricultural data. So it's really fun to, things coming full circle in the, and it's obviously we're really proud to be an active part of the ag community here in North Carolina. And as Ray noted, we were excited to sort of sponsor the QPC, as the Chamber likes to call it, or the Quarterly Polling Club.
We got that from SAS.
Oh, yeah. We all love acronyms, right? And so I was thinking about, it was valuable to SAS for a number of reasons for us to kind of support this and sponsor this. One, in our business, it's any insights we can glean about consumer sentiment and what's kind of going on is always golden. It helps us better understand the overall landscape and in the, and how we can better support our customers as they are trying to meet the ever-evolving needs of consumers. So that's kind of value driver number one. Number two, we have over 4,000 employees here in North Carolina alone, and we are really committed to, with our headquarters here in North Carolina, just like all of you in this room, being part of this organization, committed to making North Carolina the best place it can be. And then perhaps most importantly, the fact that this study was going to be have a larger purpose, if you will, in driving the conversations for the Shared Values Initiative is kind of a win-win. So, all right, we can go ahead and dive on in. And so Ray and I are gonna kind of tag team these slides. And I think there should be plenty of time for people to raise their hand and ask questions. We may not have the answer. You might have just a comment that you think that you saw something in the data that we didn't. So feel free to speak up, raise your hand, and we'll go from there.
And when you do, we will hand you a microphone because we want to make sure it gets recorded too.
Okay, perfect. All right, so setting the stage here. This was a survey that was completed with 500, a little bit less than 650, but we're still up there, statistically significant. And it was 500 registered voters across the state, and it was conducted in late summer 2021, most likely on a 95-degree North Carolina, 95% humidity day. So as you can see, we have a nice distribution of age here. No one group dominated the survey by any means. The largest cohort was that 55 through 64. Really even gender balance. And from an ethnicity standpoint, the 500 respondents were 69% Caucasian, 21% African American, and 10% a combination of Native American, Latino, and Asian. Okay, in contact method, I had to look up text to web, but it's really just texting. I was like, is this something special? So they were contacted either mobile, landline, or text. And one thing that is not on here that I think Ray made sure of is that the population of folks, these 500 respondents, they actually match, they mirror our general election electorate. So we had 39% Democrat, 33% Republican, 27% unaffiliated. Is that correct?
Yep.
Okay.
And that's the actual turnout. So the registration numbers may be a little bit different proportionally, but
Okay.
if you look back at the elections and how those different groups have actually turned out, then that's how we got those divisions.
Okay. Okay. Alrighty. So setting the stage there. Okay. So this slide is obviously North Carolina residency. As you can see, about half of our survey respondents were native North Carolinians. About half moved here from somewhere else. I thought it was really interesting. 82% is, if you combine the last two bars there, are either native or have lived in North Carolina for over 10 years. And so what I liked about that when I was kind of reading into it is, there's some significant tenure in the state of this group of people in terms of, what their sentiments may be about ag. And another stat that's interesting, that may not be that surprising to you all, but interesting nonetheless. So Demography NC over at UNC Chapel Hill published that while more than 90% of folks 100 years ago would have been from North Carolina, now slightly under half of our population in North Carolina is non-native. So certainly some changing demographics. And so just calling out that really, approximately our survey population sort of mirrors that of the state. All right. Okay. So lots of information in this one. But this is depicting the survey respondents' relationship to ag. So if you look at it, only 4% of the respondents were running a farm or working in ag. Some have family in ag. Almost 20% lived in what they would say an agricultural area. But 52% of this survey had no connection to ag. And so then, of course, on the bottom, you have distribution across different populations, right? And so it looks like let's see here, the distribution of the percentages is relatively similar. If you're looking across gender, voter affiliation, but we've got that over half have no connection to ag. This was actually highest among our Democrat respondents and African American respondents. And white respondents in our survey were twice as likely to report living in an ag area. All right, and I think I might be handing this over to Ray.
Yeah, so take that notion of who's familiar with ag and who's not. So across that left side there, and we've sort of got it flipped in terms of the stacking of the bars, but those native to the state, what we learned when we start cross-tabbing some of this is that if you're native to the state, you're more likely to be connected to agriculture than newcomers. Remember that, because on the next slide, we're going to show you something that might surprise you. But looking across the bottom there on that x-axis on the next slide, I think, is the number of years in the state. And how does that change your connection to agriculture? So that's what we're looking at here. And what we see is that the native born, it looks like we've got a tighter connection of those that were born here versus those that are moving in from somewhere else. Hold that thought though, because in a minute we're going to ask across these different groups, those born native here 10 years or more versus those that have moved here, who has the better impression of ag, and you might be surprised by the results. So on the next slide, this is interesting because we pulled the data on the left side here. Everything from the left side of the yellow bar came from our survey. Everything on the right side comes from the annual Gallup survey, this one from 2021, so that we're comparing data from similar years. Of course, last year there was that's from 2020. So last year there was a new Gallup set of data. Probably the only thing to take away from that is that the ag remained the top industry. Well, I mention this because I think there are really two key takeaways here. Just like in the Gallup study, here in North Carolina, farming and ag are the top tested industry, a net positive of 47. So when you take the we like you and subtract the we don't like yous, we still end up with a 47 positive rating in ag. A second takeaway is that every industry does worse when you ask North Carolinians their impression of it than the national data. Now, I don't know what that means. I think the one thing we can take away is that people really do answer these questions differently at different times. I mean, there's really a difference in the data. But I'll leave it up to you to discern why is it that North Carolinians are more cynical about business than maybe the national respondents are. I would arrogantly attribute it to the fact that our well-trained and well-equipped workforce might be a little harder to impress than maybe the national workforce as a whole. I've also been warned that many of you are close to the healthcare industry, and so that if you look there and you see only 42%, and this would have been, of course, when COVID was still an even bigger issue than it is today, why would that number be low or lower than ag? I don't know the answer to that, but I think the real man bites dog story here is that if you go to, and Mitch will back me up, any commodity association or farm bureau meeting across the state, this is not what they're going to tell you they're feeling. They're going to say people don't appreciate us, they don't thank us, they don't realize the sacrifices we make. There's like this whole ball of unprocessed anguish over the fact that society does not honor farmers enough. And trust me, I've felt that way. I've been in these rooms. I agree with that sometimes. And so I think I'll come to you. I think the big takeaway here is that's not right. I mean, the data would tell us that people think very highly of agriculture and farmers, more highly than they do of folks in other industries. There's a question already, but I think Paul planted it, so I'm not sure.
He did. This is all his fault. No, I just wondered, you probably mentioned it, but I missed it. Where did you get the data? I mean, was there a certain group of people that you went out and looked for? Were they voters? Were they shoppers?
Yeah, so these are the 500 folks that are surveyed are likely voters, and then they're divided demographically and partisanly according to what we had in the most recent election turnouts. So half of the survey is trying to make political judgments and political estimates. So you obviously want to ask those people that are going to be engaged in the political process. So clearly one of the biases here may be that the real general public thinks different than the part of the public that actually participates in the democratic process.
Right.
So that's admittedly, that's a limitation of the study, right? Great question. There's another one.
Just to follow a bit on that, in geography, so
We've got that slide.
you got, perfect.
Yep, it's coming.
I'll say-
The challenge is your sample size gets pretty small when you get far out northeast, far out west, but we'll cover that. It's a great question.
Can I make a quick comment about what you said about?
Absolutely, Courtney.
About what you said about how it's interesting that farmers they have this vision. I think what you said was farmers think that consumers don't think well of them. And that's because, I think it's because they don't have conversations with each other. So the only people that the farmers are having conversations with is large corporate buyers, you know, and so they don't have a frame of reference. It's all based on money and price and what those buyers are saying. And they don't have an opportunity to have a conversation with consumers like it used to be. So the more we can facilitate that conversation where it's not just, it's farmers giving information to consumers, but they can have that open conversation with each other, in some way, I think that would help.
Yeah, I agree with that. I would just say that I think a lot of farmers are basing that feeling on what they see in social media, what they see in the regular media. There's a lot of negative stories and negative posts that are out there.
I agree.
The other surprise you thing here to me is the tech industry having a great rating. I mean, this was actually in the, and nothing personal there, it's just that this was in the field about the time in 20, when, or I guess 21, when Capitol Hill was taking more and more interest in the large tech companies. But that did not seem to dent the faith or pride in the tech industry. So anyway, I will tee up a question for later that Carrie's actually going to answer. Who do you believe has a more positive view? Because now we've asked all of these respondents, do you have a positive view, a neutral view, or a negative view? So we're now going to look at data in a moment that says, you know, who thinks more highly of ag? Is it folks that are native, or is it folks who have moved here from somewhere else? So we'll look at that. Same data, but in a different format. Views of farming and agriculture. Actually, it's interesting. I don't think I have that one in my notes, or maybe I do. Yeah, I flipped 2 pages at the same time. I'm really good at this. Thank y'all. This would be a good time to change the subject and say, by the way, Peter's the only guy in the room that's taller than Karen Levert. So that's how you'll know that. So starting on the left side of this, by the way, she's on the AAU team. I'll take more advice. Karen gave my daughter a pep talk at the airport one time, and she's now she's on her way to being a pro ball player. So starting on the left side here, again, the first column you've already seen. You saw what everybody aggregated thought. But then we break across these demographic groups, the second column being the national rating, so that's a different set of folks, right? But then once you get to that third column and the rest of the page, it's here's what men thought, women, Republicans, Democrats, independents, et cetera. So starting on that left side, again, 60% generally viewed farming and ag positively, with only 13% negatively. You saw those slides, that number on the previous slide. There's a lot to absorb here, but note that men and Republicans, and not me, but someone else could make the joke that said men are Republicans, or all Republicans are men, or something, I don't know, are a little more positive toward ag than are their counterparts. So certainly men more positive than women, certainly Republicans more positive than Democratic. The real strength here, though, I think, is that independent column, that unaffiliated column, how well ag does really among that swing block of voters in the state, that third column from the right. African Americans, I think that's a place to watch. I mean, it's you can't hide that that's actually the lowest of the positive view. So still net positive approval, don't miss the forest for the trees, but this one made me curious. So I dug in a little bit to see, did the African American community, were they actually more critical across the board for all industries? And what we actually found was, in fact, of all the industries surveyed, agriculture was the only category in which African Americans rated the industry lower than the average of all respondents. So there again, people were really picking and choosing their views on the different industries. So to say that differently, just to be clear, African Americans rated the tech industry, banking, healthcare, airlines, and even the pharmaceutical industry higher than those industries performed overall in the survey, but in ag, they rated it less. Looked at the same data for women, because you saw women were not quite as positive as men, and certainly not as positive as the overall average in the study. In their case, the women disliked all industries more than the average. Yes, I suppose. There you go. I'm not going to touch that one. I hope the question is not about that piece. But
No, I was just wondering, I was looking at these numbers, and because we have SAS here, I have to ask. So when you look between men and women, it's 67 and 53, Republicans and Democrats, 61 and 54. Are these statistically significant?
Well, my non-SAS training, but business statistics training tells me that I think sample size is over 30, can be. So I think I don't know. I think the sheer number can help make sure that it's statistically significant, but I'm not sure.
It's trending.
yeah, I don't know what the statisticians would say, but I would just say, looking at this kind of data with these kind of gaps, to me, it's clear enough that something's going on, right? And so what is it the statisticians actually conclude at the end of the day? More research in this area is needed. So we appreciate your partnership on the future survey of what these women think. Wasn't there a movie about that? All right, so this same data, but presented a little bit different way. This is actually how it comes to us from the pollster. And again, we flag down at the bottom the women. You see the three categories, positive, neutral, negative. So just presenting really the same data in a different view, not stripped out and put into the neat little bar charts from the previous page. The other thing you can see from this is how many folks in the survey fit into that category. So if you take party and then Republican and come across, there were 166 that ended up with splits, as you see there in the middle three columns, et cetera. So nothing other than just reinforcing the point. And we're back to Carrie.
All right. Okay, great. So this is kind of a segment, if you will, of some slides on regional attitudes. So you see we've gotten, we have the 7 different regions across the state broken down at the bottom of the chart here. And as you can see, ag does exceptionally well in the eastern part of the state, and also has very little negative in the 2 more metropolitan areas. So, even though the sample size is relatively small as it relates to the western and northeastern part of the states, these have, we do see a bit more negativity from our respondents in this part of the state.
Thank you for the question earlier. It's a nice setup.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the same question here, but just shown in a different way. And it's looking to see whether the responses were different for our native North Carolinians versus those who moved here from somewhere else. So as you can see, the new residents are among the most positive towards ag. Now it's a really small sample size because only, as you remember kind of towards the beginning, only 8% of the overall respondent pool had been in North Carolina less than 5 years. So it is a relatively small number. However, so it's just interesting that we've got, that's great that the newest members of our state have such a positive look on ag. Those who are not native but have been in the Tar Heel State for more than 10 years they actually show the narrowest support, which is kind of interesting. But still, only 15% have a negative view. And one interesting commentary, so one of the things that Ray was mentioning, we wonder if this positivity towards ag, is influenced by the fact that the majority of the new North Carolina citizens are coming in from neighboring states like Virginia, South Carolina, and Florida. So just a thought. Nothing to back that up, but just something to throw out there.
Negative correlation because they had the least association with ag in their history.
Yeah.
And yet the highest favor for it. So it'd be interesting to see if there is a correlation in that data.
Yeah.
Agreed. Agreed. Okay, so moving on, same ag attitudes, but by income. We do see that numbers improve in households with incomes in excess of $50,000. So they generally improve there, which runs a little counter to a lot of people's assumption that the higher earning folks may think less of agriculture than those who may be income constrained. Still, though, there are no real dramatic swings here whatsoever based on income level in ag attitudes. So that wasn't a real strong dependent variable, if you will.
I think Carrie's being nice. I would paraphrase what
Okay.
she just said to say, I think a lot of us in ag and a lot of the sort of farming community thinks it's the elites that want to change what we're doing. They want to tell us how to do it. And basically our data said that's not the case, that their views of ag are even higher than folks at lower income levels. I have spawned a question from the great Kelly Chapman.
Easy now. I went easy on you earlier.
Thank you. I think you and I could have a whole conversation and nobody else would know what we're saying.
I had a whole lot of thoughts I could have shouted out for you, and I didn't get you in trouble.
None of them started with amen.
There you go. I just think that we have to be very careful as we look at the data, and particularly some of the things that are standing out, and that we do not use stereotypes that we have used in the past. Because if you flip back to where you looked at Western North Carolina, I think about some of the trends for population in that area, people who are interested in totally going to organic farming. Income is not the concern as much as living off the land, so to speak. I think that we have to be cognizant of those same type of effects as you look at income in general and the distribution of people's thoughts and feelings, because when we look at people below, let's say, 75 or 50,000, there's a great mix of socioeconomic influences going on there that we wouldn't have had 10 years ago. And then the other thing, as you went through the data that I was interested in thinking about, when we look at native North Carolinians versus more than 10 years, I think, Ray, you and I and Mitch, if not a lot of other people here, remember what we've been through in terms of waste management in the state more than 10 years ago. We think about some of the major storm events we had and some of the impact or impressions that made upon people, so I think that part of what you've picked up on in this data, in my opinion, is that this is a much more complex situation. And we also, I think it would be interesting to know if you compared this data here in North Carolina, or if you took the same data in California. I'd say California's would look like ours, but if you went to South Georgia or Kansas, how different would it look because of the changes happening in our population? So I think that your sampling has really picked up on the complexity of what this issue looks like, and there's not going to be one size fits all answer, Mitch, for the community in agriculture. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be that long-winded.
That's really, really insightful. Alrighty, oops, went one too far. Okay, so this looked at ag attitudes as it related to grocery spending. And this one, we didn't really see anything. We didn't find too much to extrapolate here. But the question here was obviously, if whether what you thought about agriculture differed depending on how much you would spend on food on a weekly basis, on groceries. We figured that it didn't look like there was too much to learn here, but generally speaking, that the spend here probably has more to do, if nothing else, with household size, right? So we didn't see any strong to learn here. Okay. This question that was asked of the respondents was about food supply chain concerns. Specifically, how concerned are you, survey respondent, that the food chain and other, the food chain could be interrupted again in the future, similar to the onset of the pandemic. And remember, this is July of last year, with meat products, toiletries, and sanitizing products. So we're about 15, 16 months away from the start of the pandemic. So 40% said very concerned, as you can see on the left. 40% somewhat concerned. 19% were not at all concerned, and 1% undecided. And Ray said that the chamber actually asked this same question in 2020. And so basically compared that data to what we have here. And essentially, that concern about the food supply chain has dipped, but only a little.
That's right.
And we also don't see notable differences across the groups here that we'd seen in that 2022 or 2020 question. On this slide, we see two depictions. On the left are respondents' concern about the food supply chain by age, and on the right by income level. Not surprisingly, we continue to see that concern about what may happen with the food supply chain does not decrease with income level. Also, those under 45 tend to be the least concerned, which gave me a good chuckle because I think those under 45 are generally the least concerned about anything, about all things. That's something we can
Ignorance is bliss.
we can extrapolate that. Okay, so we're switching gears a bit to some deeper thoughts. The respondents were asked, what comes to mind when thinking about farming and ag in North Carolina? And their responses were quite positive. So if you take a moment to read and look at the different percentages there, quite a few positive associations, hardworking families, essential to the supply chain and the economy. There's some neutral associations around just pure ag production in the state. A very small percentage with negative associations. We were talking about this actually just before, but the 19% that associated ag with farming challenges is really interesting because it indicates that there's an awareness of that in all the things that farmers overcome and face sometimes. So probably the most striking thing is that 20% or 1 in 5 people do not know what they think when they're thinking about farming and ag in North Carolina. And that was actually as high as 1 in 3 in the triad.
Yeah, people in Winston-Salem really don't know.
Yeah. So anyways, just some interesting takeaways. We're going to see this in a few different forms here. Okay, same data, just presented in a bar chart format. We don't need to spend too much time on this, but it's again that 20%, the highest percentage in the entire chart. They don't know. So, okay, same data again, except in pie chart format. And so essentially the smaller pie charts on the bottom compare the positive associations versus the negative associations by percentage. And then, the essential to state and economy, that's the red arrow, that's the 8%, and then food and crop is the yellow and going down there. So just a different way to look at it. Okay. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, I mean, isn't that saying that the more they know, the more positive they are about it versus the less they know? Because the negative knows less. Is that right? 30%? Am I reading that right? The 30% versus the 16%? No. Am I reading that wrong?
It's not no more or less. The bottom two are if it was a respondent that told us they thought positively of the industry.
Right.
16% of them said they don't know what they think.
Only 16% of them said they didn't.
When they hear farming and ag, they don't know what they think of for an open-ended question. And then if you're negative, 30% didn't give us a response. So I don't know if I'm affirming or disagreeing with what you said, but that's what those two. And actually, the way they're presented there, they're actually not pie charts. They're like brie charts. See how they're kind of three-dimensional? Yeah.
I like it. I agree.
That kind of tracks with some of the data from our focus group. We had a large segment of people, when you ask them what they feel about agriculture, they don't know.
But they're negative.
But they say they never really think about it. So they have sort of a neutral view. It's just not on the radar screen.
Yeah.
Well, it's hard for those of us in this room to think about it, but there are people who don't know enough to know, they can't think about it because they don't have any concept of ag or food production.
Yeah.
But that's a real challenge for our industry because those people are very receptive to the negative message about you shouldn't use chemicals, you shouldn't have animal confinement, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, I I think that's exactly right. I think those are the blank slates, right? Those are the ones, depends on who gets there to write first, in some cases. So that's great. And I actually think, Courtney, maybe we are on the same page. I mean, I hadn't thought about this, it's like double. If you were negative the industry, you're not willing to tell me what you actually think
Because
about
you don't really know, that's what I'm
But you
saying, is
responded
they don't
earlier,
really
just-
know.
yeah.
That's
Right.
why they're negative.
Yeah. Kind of the way I feel about Carolina
The more they
basketball.
know, the more positive they are. Sorry.
Good.
Oh my goodness, love it. Okay. So this is all of those responses that we've been talking about in word cloud form. So one thing I sort of found interesting about this, in addition to a lot of the associations you've seen come out on previous slides, we see a few new things. So for example, you see tobacco as a fairly large word in the word cloud, which I thought was interesting. Imagining that half the respondents being native North Carolinians, there may be kind of a collective consciousness here among the respondents of kind of the historical importance of tobacco to the state. But obviously seeing some positive associations, support, help, good, food, work, and this one is more. This might be philosophical, but the word "more," I think that could have come out in multiple contexts, right? But is it possible? But that was in responses that there's a awareness of ag being asked to consistently do more, produce more, be more. We don't necessarily know. I guess we could look at the 300-page.
Crosstabs.
Yeah, crosstabs. But all right, I'm going to hand it over to Ray. He's going to talk about something he has been working on.
Yes, I get to do a little self-promotion here. John, make sure you get this right. It's Farmers versus Foodies. And it's coming out probably in June. We thought in May, but apparently there's a paper shortage. There's supply chain issues. But I was told I could mention my forthcoming book, which the Biotech Center has actually agreed with the generous support of Smith Anderson to buy for everyone who's in attendance. Sort of, yeah. So anyway, truth is, I'm actually tired of the book at this point. I've worked on it for like 2 years, but I'll tell you how it fits in, and it's not just a shameless plug. The basic idea is that there clearly is, and certainly the ag industry feels this, the thought leadership, I think, across the farming and ag industry feels that there's a battle over who's going to define the future of the industry. Will it be the farmers and the allied industry representatives, like many or most or probably all of us in this room, or will it be folks that I call in the book outsiders, not a derogatory term, but just a term to refer to folks who have never really worked in ag, they certainly have never put capital at risk in ag, and who think because they read a Atlantic article by Michael Pollan, they're now qualified to opine on ag, on an entire sector of the economy. And so I think farmers really feel the pressure of these outsiders. We feel like they have a little bigger megaphone than we do. Now again, I think the data in our survey would say you don't have to worry about that as much as you thought you have to worry about that. But perception's reality. And so they sense that these changes are going to come to the industry because folks outside of the industry are forcing those things to happen. A good amount of that comes from consumer pressure, and certainly a lot of the CPG companies play on whatever it is the consumer wants, whether it's rational for that consumer to want it or not. And so in the ag sector, and John I think would agree with this, when you're going to commodity meetings, when you're going to national meetings and conferences, a lot of them have someone from the marketing side come in and present and say, hey, here's what the consumer of tomorrow wants. And you have that discussion, you think about what that's going to mean to your industry, but that's about as deep as it goes. We don't ever talk about the forces in the media, we don't talk about the forces in the legal arena, we don't talk about the international forces, we don't talk about the policy forces, all places where I think that traditional ag leaders and traditional ag thinkers on issues like policy are, I believe, experiencing an erosion of their ability to get the outcomes that they want. And so the book kind of chronicles all those other groups that are shaping the industry, but the key thing it does is it asks why. Why is that happening? What's behind that? And I think there are a lot of ag speakers that will come into your conference and say, these people are beating up on you. We got to fight back. And that's a good message, right? That gets people excited, but then they leave and there's never really a plan. So when I got about 2/3 through the book, I realized, oh yeah, I'm gonna have to propose some ideas at the end for what we do about this. But really my interest was, why is that criticism coming forward? Why is that surfacing? Why do people who live in a country where they spend about the lowest percentage of their disposable income on food of any country in the world, why do they have these competing ideas and criticisms of the ag industry? And so part of that is answered, I feel like, in the book. Even if it's a minority group of people that have that negative view, where is it that they get that from? Where's that coming from? How can that be? Because sort of to be transparent, my view is that view is relatively absurd in a country that's as blessed as ours with as safe and affordable of a food supply as we have. So if you want me to explain that, that's another talk. And your chamber membership dues don't cover it. So we'll come back and do that at another time. But of course, at the end, it says that the ag insiders, the farm and agribusiness folks, like those of us in this room, the AgTech community, there are some things I think we can be doing about that. But one of the central stage setting parts is in chapter 2, I titled that chapter Humpty Dumptyism, because there's this seemingly ubiquitous notion that we need to revamp, reboot, rebuild, rehabilitate, re-revolutionize, rectify, rebrand the food system. A lot of times you'll see the word, we need to dismantle the system and start over. And that broken, that the system is somehow broken, that narrative really frustrates me personally, because I think the system has done exactly what we've asked it to do, particularly since World War II. And I think maybe we want to ask the system to do something different now or to do something more. But it's pretty much done what we ask it to do coming out of World War II. So I think that sets the stage for a little bit more of this data. Where do these ideas come from? And what do people really think that it is the job of the ag industry to do? So on the next slide, we ask a closed-ended question. We randomize, and that's just a part of the typical polling process. But to me, the responses to this say that ag's job, what about 50% of the public expects and wants ag to do, is to grow food. And so there are all these other peripheral conversations, and again, things we need to do better, the environmental respect, the sustainability, community development, all that kind of good stuff. But most folks, over 50% of the respondents still said, I want you to make sure that food and ag products are available when we need them, and I want them to be healthy, safe, and affordable. So in other words, keep the main thing the main thing. This is how it breaks down across the different demographic groups. Again, overall, 54% want the focus to be on some form of production. I get to that 54% by adding safe and affordable to the make products, the top two numbers there on that left one. I think the most substantial difference when asking this question is that there's a difference among party lines. Republicans tend to want products available, while Democrats are more likely to focus on some of the sustainability issues. And then a worthwhile observation about age, the balance between environmental concerns and production is narrowest among those under 45. This gap is much wider among those older. I didn't put that on the slide, the age one, but I think it's an interesting observation. Interestingly, among those who work in ag, sustainability really pops. So if you work in ag, you actually said that part of the role of ag was to be sustainable at a higher percentage than you said that it was actually, or at a similar percentage as it was to make products. So I think that's interesting, although maybe I need to back up there. I probably didn't say that accurately. Again, not missing the forest for the trees. Over half of those working in ag still said the most important role is to produce, but another quarter of them said it's about sustainability. So I think that's interesting, and maybe goes to our defensiveness that we want people to understand that we agree that ag has to be sustainable and we have to have sustainable practices. Here again, this is the raw data, the way it broke out. The real reason I want to show you this on this chart is that least, we asked them to rank them most important, second most important, and then least important. And the one that really pops here is, particularly for a state that gets 66% of its ag economy from livestock and poultry, 30% of the respondents ranked basically animal welfare as the least important issue. That is not what Kelly and I would have thought from our years in thinking about animal ag and conversations we've had around that over the last few years. If you were to add those first two columns together, the most important and second most important, and actually this chart does that, it just puts them in rank order. Note that those top categories relate to producing food. A clear 40% say that affordability or availability are most important. We don't really see a difference here on the data of whether someone was more or less familiar with agriculture. There was one crosstab that was worth looking at, those with a neutral view of ag. And so I'll ask you, do you think those with a neutral view of farming and ag care more or less about animal welfare and community improvement than those with a positive impression of ag? So neutral, of course, it's like, you know, I wouldn't be asking you unless I was trying to lead you astray. Neutral actually cares less about the animal welfare issue, which I think, again, that people are crazy, right? This is what you learn when you dig down into this stuff. But again, even those neutral to farming and ag, at the top of the list is that affordability and availability of food. So we asked a very similar question, but not the same. So this question, keep in mind, is what is most important? But then we followed it with a question, what concerns you the most about farming and agriculture in North Carolina? On this similar question, we see that food safety and affordability rise to the top of the list. Again, this was a closed list where they had to rank them most and second most important and least important. The most divisive issue is the corporate ownership issue, with 17% saying it's one of their top issues and 28% saying it's their least important issue. That means only 55% didn't mention it, either positively or negatively. And most of these responses were in sort of the 70 or 80 percentile of not being mentioned. So it's interesting that comes up, that we would think, I think, if you read, you know, if you're following along on Twitter, you would think everybody hates consolidation in ag, everybody hates the big companies. But actually we had a pretty substantial group of people, 28%, saying, I could care less about that. That's the least I care about when it comes to ag. What concerns the negative Nancys? So in other words, those people that told us that they had a negative view toward ag, so that's less than a third of the sample size. I think the real conundrum here is they're really split. Some of them say, you see the highest number halfway down, corporate ownership. I'm negative toward ag, and the top reason I may be negative toward ag is because of this corporate ownership problem. But then the least important is 22% among those people think corporate ownership. So once again, the real conundrum is that they rank corporate ownership and involvement as both their most and their least concerning issues. But again, the one I would flag at the bottom right corner of the page, even those with negative views toward ag, over 1 in 5 of them say they would put animal well-being at the bottom of the list. In the meantime, California passes propositions to change cage sizes and gestation crates and all this kind of good stuff. And yet our respondents would say 1 in 5 of us, that's our least important issue. I think that's fascinating. Views of farming and ag by media, and then we're probably getting in the short roads.
Yeah, we're gonna roll through these really quickly so we can move over to Mitch. Okay, so this looks at the views of farming by the respondents' favored media platform. So kind of bottom line here, those that had social media as their preferred media platform were the least positive towards ag at 48%, and that our newspaper readers were the most positive at 67.
Karen,
Yes.
the last slide,
Yeah.
the sort of chaos of criticisms, what do y'all make of that? I mean, it's like a scattershot of people fly-specking. I mean, there's some concentration, but it seems sort of all over the board. What do y'all?
Well, what I make of it, it goes along with the theme I've sort of tried to present this afternoon, which is I think our impression of what people who don't think highly of us actually focus on is perhaps different than what they actually focus on. Because I would have thought, if I hadn't seen the numbers, and you said, why do people, of the group that's negative, why? Why do they think negatively? What do they think negatively about? I would have thought maybe animal welfare. I would have thought impact on neighbors and community. That goes to our nuisance litigation discussions that we've had in the state over the last 5 years. I would think worker treatment. I would think consolidation in the industry and corporate ownership. But even people who are negative, what they think is most important is that we got to produce food. My 2 cents.
So Mitch, you might remember 2014 or so with the GMO Answers Initiative, biotech here in the Biotech Center was a big focus, a big concern to consumers. Today we're now working with CRISPR. You could say the gene toolbox is more amazing than it's ever been, and yet we don't see any of that in this data. So I don't know if you asked about biotechnology or if you have a general sense overall why or if that has kind of fallen off the radar when the technology is racing ahead, and that seems to be a conflict.
He said Mitch.
Well, I asked him if he remembered.
We're talking about your data, though. No, I think you did actually ask that in the questions, I thought. But anyway, you know, I think people's attitudes do change over time. I think back when we saw people were concerned about GMOs back in the late 90s, early 2000s and everything, the arguments that the opposition groups were making against GMOs, I think people realized that they didn't hold up. And I think so that's played into part of it, I think, over time. And then this new stage of CRISPR technology, I think people sort of view that more favorably and more closely aligned with traditional breeding and things like that. So I think that's sort of played into it as well. But
I was going to
yeah,
say, didn't
people's
you have a
attitudes change.
stat that
We
said,
didn't ask a specific question about biotech or GMO. That would be a great question on a future survey by a partner that's sitting in the room. I will say this, though, that, and I'll try to keep it brief. When we ask them open-ended, what do you think about when you think about ag? Virtually nobody brought that up. I actually think that would have been different 7 or 8 years ago. So I think y'all must have done really good work.
but you did ask the question, what do you think, or I can't remember what it was. Are you supportive of things that help farmers with production? I can't remember what the wording was, and they were highly in favor of anything that helped farmers produce more with less. So however that was worded made me feel like that kind of fell within that.
Pull that in, sure.
Yeah.
Could be.
Yeah. All right, last 2 slides on the study so we can get to Mitch here. Okay, so if we take a look at where our voters, respondents get their local news, we see in large part this is still coming from local television stations, some online websites, and less so among local newspapers and social media. And last slide here, okay. Another one with lots of information on it. So in this particular question, the respondents were asked, generally speaking, how much trust and confidence do you have in North Carolina media outlets, like broadcast TV stations and major newspapers, to report fairly, accurately, and fully? Okay, and so as you can see, kind of on the very left, we have 30% that is no trust and confidence at all, 27% not very much, 31% a fair amount, and 7% a great deal. And we have 57% of respondents say they have no trust or not very much trust in North Carolina media outlets. And notably, 1% of Republicans say they trust North Carolina-based media. And yeah, it's very different than the other groups.
And for me, just over here, one of the challenges this is going to lead into, let's assume that this is representative of your state representatives or your federal representatives. This is the mindset you got going in to create legislation that relate to ag. So I don't think any of us probably are surprised with some of these statistics we're seeing here, but when you play it out, it has a real threat to how we run ag and what we want to do, because there's a lot of misconceptions going into office, let's say, or has the potential to be.
Which is a great segue to Mitch's. And Michelle, is that at the beginning? Are his slides? Oh, there. Keep going. Okay, got it. Here we go.
All right, well, I told you at the beginning that the Chamber and SAS poll went into a lot of data, a lot of information. That's a lot of stuff we went over here the last several minutes. I'm not going to do that with the focus groups. Number one is, as I told you before, we didn't ask as many questions, but we dive sort of into the questions and dig into a little bit more greater understanding of why they responded the way they did. So all of my findings are on one slide. So this is it. So this is the focus groups we did last summer. As I said before, did 4 of those across the state for the major metropolitan areas. And we focused on people that did not have a connection to agriculture as part of those focus groups. And you can see here that a lot of the results are similar to what we found in the statewide poll that the Chamber and others did. Trust in farmers remains high. They really trust farmers. Now they don't necessarily trust some of the modern farming practices. That's still a challenge in some areas, but they trust the farmers themselves. And they really like small farmers, and they quite often would mention going to farmers markets and talking one-on-one with the farmers. And when that happens, then they're hooked. They're in the game, and we can talk with them, regardless of what their attitudes were early on. So that's one of the things that we're going to be looking at in the future when we talk about some of the findings going forward, is look at opportunities to bring consumers and farmers together and go to those places where consumers and farmers are already located and just take advantage more of that in the future. So even though they don't understand agriculture, they trust farmers. When you talk about what their greatest concerns are, this tracks with what the poll showed us earlier. Regardless of what you see in the media about what consumers are most concerned with, these 3 things came to the top always. It's food safety or freshness, affordability, and then now, primarily because of the pandemic, availability. I don't think people really, I don't recall that being even in the top 10 or so in past polls and that we've done in the past. People really took it for granted, never had to really worry about it. But the pandemic has changed things. And then this continues to be a bias with a lot of consumers out there, is that they just don't like big ag. They really don't like big anything. They don't like big industry. They don't like big farms, not just the companies, the agribusinesses, but they don't like big farms either. And so when we ask them further, you say you don't like big ag, you don't like big farm, you don't like big agribusiness. Okay, but you like smaller ones. At what point does a farm become a big farm and you start to lose trust in them? And without fail, none of them could respond to that. None of them had a clue. They just know they don't like big. That's maybe requires some further digging in the future. And then remember, this is shared values project. So if we didn't ask them what the things they value most, then we would have failed to meet our objective. And you can see here on the screen the things that came to the top. These are the things that they value the most. And a lot of those are associated with their people's character in general, or their things that relate to them personally, their home life and things like that. But you do see things like environment is on there, protecting the environment, which we all support that, and sustainability, but they specifically mentioned financial sustainability. So a lot of people are talking about agricultural sustainability this day and time, but a lot of people are talking about that without thinking about the need to be financially stable, sustainable as well. So that's the values we identified. I mentioned at the end of the year, we brought all of the ag commodity groups together and a lot of the allied partners together to go over these findings of the consumer research And we met over a 2-day period in breakout sessions, and we came up with recommendations. Now, we do not have all of the answers. We're not going to pretend that we do. We have a lot of work to do in that area. But, yes, thank you. But these are the sort of the collective wisdom of the ag leaders in the various groups across the state coming together and sort of brainstorming about, well, here's a way that we can address this concern, or here's how we can focus on this particular value in doing a better job in communicating with consumers going forward. So those recommendations were in 3 main areas that you can see on the screen. We need to increase engagement. We need to increase transparency. And overall, we need to build capacity and capabilities in our networks of groups that we work with. And I'll just say something about transparency. I think I actually skipped over a slide, didn't I? Let me back up. There you go. I forgot to mention, at the Consumer Summit, we had a speaker that came in and gave us a look at what the consumer of the future might look like. And you can see here on the screen that he reminded everyone that millennials are now the largest segment of the population, no longer the baby boomers. So that's going to factor into some of our decisions on who to target going forward. It's not just the younger generations that are driven by their values, but it's, you know, all generations are to that to some extent, but the youngers are more driven by that, which means that data, that facts and figures and science in some cases may not mean as much in trying to communicate with the younger audiences. It needs to be based more on values and emotion. Some of these food trends that are out there, I think maybe the assumption is that it's just the younger audiences, younger population that are adopting those, but that's not the case. We see that's the case across all segments of the population. Consumers want it all. They don't have to pick and choose. They want everything. And food as a medicine is becoming more an important topic. And you may assume that that's the older generations, folks like myself, who are more experienced and seasoned, are more concerned about our health now and taking better care of ourselves. But it's not just us. It's shown that even the younger generations are now thinking more about their diets and what they eat and taking care of themselves, which is a good thing. And there's still, as we said, there's this bias out there against big, and research has shown that the best way to overcome that bias is through more transparency, to be more open with consumers, to share more with them. That doesn't mean sharing trade secrets or proprietary information or anything like that, but just in some cases, just being more transparent in the fact that you're willing to open up and have a dialogue with consumers and welcome any question or concern they may have as an opportunity to engage in conversation. And then here, so definitions change over time. It's not just the definition of safe, but we continue to have to battle with that issue as well. So the recommendations going forward are those 3 categories I mentioned earlier, and specifically increasing engagement. First of all, we need to have volunteers. We need to have our farmers, identify those farmers who are willing to serve as an example of engaging in conversation with today's consumers. Organizations that will volunteer to take a lead in that area. So we need to identify those individuals, organizations that will volunteer to be the leaders, and values-based communication. So engaging in conversation with consumers using these shared values as a segue into that. We need to look for those opportunities to bring consumers and farmers and other food voices together to have these conversations. I mentioned the farmers market, but it's state fair and it's other things you know, farmer panels, tours, foodie events, but certainly social media is a huge opportunity to bring farmers and consumers together. So we have to take advantage of those opportunities and identify more of those going forward. We may need to target certain audiences. I mentioned that millennials are the largest segment of the population. We may target some communications in that direction, or we may target the media or others in our communications outreach. We need to reach out and we need to network and partner with groups that maybe we traditionally have not worked with in the past as an opportunity to introduce us into new audiences going forward. And we need to build a bigger network of experts. So farmers are always the first choice. We always want to use farmers when we can as the communicators because they're the most trusted. But there's other people out there that we can use, other food voices. This could be dietitians. This could be food retailers. This could be chefs, celebrity chefs. This could be people in the academic circles. It could be a medical doctor. It could be a veterinarian. There's a lot of people that we can turn to help us in communicating with today's consumers. And then we just need to look at our internal, in our organizations, our existing communications programs, and look at how we can use transparency and this idea of shared values communication in our communications efforts. The second area is to commit to transparency, which is, it's going to be a little challenge because the question is, you know, what does that mean? And so we've got to identify how we can be more open to the public to respond to these questions and concerns they have about today's agriculture, and look at those areas where they say they have concerns with, or even what you see in the social media area of environmental concerns or animal health and things like that. How we can use transparency as a way to overcome some of those feelings and target our communications going forward. And again, like I said earlier, just look at our existing programs and how we can put these practices and these recommendations into place. And then lastly, just in summary, just overall, we just need to build a group of champions. These are individuals and organizations that can serve as an example for the rest of us in the area of values-based communication, but transparency as well. We need to build a network of food voices in addition to farmers as well and other advocates. And then we need to give them the tools they need to be successful. So we need to come up with ways that they can be transparent in their communications, give them the tools in that areas. So we've got some homework to do going forward. But this is, just to give you an idea, these are the recommendations of the best minds in the ag community today have come up with in response to this consumer research. And so we're sharing that with you. None of this information in the slides here is confidential. I know some particular data I think maybe you've held back on, but what you see here today is meant to share with a large audience. So feel free to share this with others, and collectively, hopefully, we'll have an impact on consumers going forward. So Michelle, that's it. I think time-wise, we're probably at the end, but if somebody's got a burning question, we'll try to respond to those.
No
Quickly.
questions from Kelly.
Sorry.